Tripoli was now under constant siege, but the city itself remained untouched. Raymond controlled the land routes leading to it, but he lacked a strong naval presence. The Banu Ammar, however, had access to great wealth and maintained a sizable merchant fleet, allowing them to bring supplies from Egyptian ports in the south. Still, Raymond's castle posed a serious threat to their freedom of movement. Toward the end of summer, the Banu Ammar launched a raid and set fire to the suburbs up to the castle walls. During the attack, Raymond was injured when a burning roof collapsed on him the following spring. Fakhr al-Mulk agreed to negotiate a truce with the Christians, giving them control over the suburbs. However, shortly after the agreement was finalized, Raymond, who had never fully recovered from the injuries he sustained 6 months earlier, fell gravely ill. He died on February 28, 1105, at Mount Pilgrim. The bold exploits of his later years had restored his reputation, and he was mourned as a noble Christian knight who had chosen the struggles of the Holy War over the comforts of his homeland. This praise was well earned. Unlike many other crusaders, who had settled in the East and had little standing in their homelands, Raymond had come from a wealthy and influential background in Europe. Although he had vowed never to return, he still maintained some control over its affairs. His death created a succession issue both in Toulouse and in the region of Lebanon. He had left Toulouse in the hands of his eldest son, Bertrand. However, Bertrand's right to inherit was disputed, possibly because he was born out of wedlock. Of all the children Raymond had with Countess Elvira, only one survived, a newborn boy named Alfonso Jordan, born just a few months earlier in the castle at Mount Pilgrim. It was evident that such a young child could not possibly govern a fragile military state in the East, and news of his birth may not even have reached Toulouse yet. Bertrand continued to rule over Raymond's European domains. In the East, Raymond's troops selected his cousin, William Jordan, Count of Chardin, to succeed him. Likely according to Raymond's final wishes, William Jordan had only recently arrived in the East. His maternal grandmother was Raymond's maternal aunt, making him a close relative. He saw himself as regent for his infant cousin and chose not to take any formal title related to the eastern lands. Still, as long as Alfonso Jordan lived, neither William Jordan nor Bertrand could feel entirely secure in their positions. William Jordan continued the strategy of his predecessor, maintaining pressure on Tripoli through the blockade and upholding the alliance with the Byzantine Empire. At the emperor's request, Eumadius Philocales, the governor of Cyprus, sent an envoy to receive William Jordan's homage and to offer him generous gifts in return. By agreeing to this, William Jordan secured regular shipments of supplies from Cyprus for the Crusader camp outside Tripoli, and Byzantine troops occasionally assisted in the siege. As supplies flowed steadily into the Frankish camp, conditions inside Tripoli grew dire. Overland routes were completely cut off, and although some ships from Fatimid ports and even from territories controlled by Tancred managed to slip through the blockade, they couldn't bring in nearly enough to support the city's large population. Food prices skyrocketed. A pound of dates could cost an entire gold coin. Those who were able fled the city. Inside the walls, famine and disease took hold. Fakhr al-Mulk tried to ease the suffering by distributing food. Funded by special taxes to the sick and to the soldiers, some prominent citizens fled to the Crusader camp and revealed the secret routes through which supplies were still being smuggled into the city. Fakhr al-Mulk offered William Jordan a large ransom in exchange for these men. When the count refused to hand them over, the traitors were later found murdered in the Christian camp. Fakhr al-Mulk had few options left. Turning to the Fatimids for help would mean surrendering his state to them. He was also on bad terms with Tarakan of Homs, his most natural ally, who had assumed control of Damascus after Dukak's death in 1104, and was himself engaged in ongoing conflict with William Jordan. With no nearby allies to count on, Fakhr looked farther afield. In 1105, he sent a desperate plea for help to Soghman the Ordikid in Mardin. Soghman, interested in returning to the Syrian front, gathered a large army and began the march across the desert, but upon reaching Palmyra, he suddenly died. His generals quickly retreated to the Jezereh, where they turned their focus to internal power struggles. Despite worsening conditions, Fakhr managed to hold on in Tripoli through 1106 and 1107, thanks largely to his wealth and skill in diplomacy. His relationship with Totikan improved during this time, and Totikan's attacks against the Franks, including his recapture of Rafania in 1105, offered some relief. Still, the Franks had firmly entrenched themselves along the Lebanese coast, and no nearby Muslim power seemed willing or able to dislodge them. In the spring of 1108, desperate and running out of options, Fakhr al-Mulk made the decision to personally appeal for aid from the highest authorities in his faith, the Caliph of Baghdad and the Seljuk Sultan Muhammad. In March, Fakhr al-Mulk departed from Tripoli, leaving its administration in the hands of his cousin Abu Manaqib ibn Amr. Before setting off, he paid all his soldiers 6 months' wages in advance. He had already informed Totikan of his plans and apparently received permission from William Jordan to travel through territory controlled by the Franks. Fakhr was accompanied by a bodyguard of 500 men and brought along many lavish gifts for the Sultan. Upon reaching Damascus, Totikan welcomed him with full honors. The leading emirs of the city also presented him with generous gifts, though, as a precaution, Fakhr stayed outside the city walls. When he resumed his journey, Totikan's son, Taj al-Mulk Buri, joined his escort. As Fakhr neared Baghdad, he was treated with great respect. The Sultan sent his personal barge to ferry him across the Euphrates, and he was allowed to rest on the very cushion normally reserved for the Sultan himself. Although Fakhr had never claimed a title above that of Cadi, he entered Baghdad with the full ceremonial honors due a ruling prince. Both the Caliph and the Sultan greeted him warmly, expressing admiration for his service to Islam and treating him like a brother. However, when discussions turned to matters of state, the hollowness of their compliments became clear. The Sultan promised to send the powerful Seljuk army to lift the siege of Tripoli, but first, he said, there were more pressing matters closer to Baghdad, such as dealing with the rebellious emir of Mosul, Jawali. Fakhr quickly realized that the Sultan had no real intention of intervening. After 4 months of luxury and empty promises at the Sultan's court, he finally set out to return home, only to discover that he no longer had one, back in Tripoli. Abu Manaqib and the city's leading figures had accepted the harsh realities of the situation. They recognized that only the Fatimids, with some remaining naval power, had any real ability to assist them. They appealed to the Egyptian vizier al-Afdal, asking him to send a governor to take control of the city. Al-Afdal responded by appointing Sharaf ad-Dawla, who arrived in Tripoli during the summer of 1108, bringing large quantities of grain for the population. He quickly established authority without resistance. All of Fakhr al-Mulk's supporters were arrested and sent to Egypt. Fakhr had just reached Damascus when he learned of the political upheaval. He still held Jabla, a town to the north of Tortosa, and made his way there, but his control of Jabla did not last long. In May 1109, Tancred of Antioch appeared before the city with a full military force. Fakhr immediately surrendered, under the condition that he could continue ruling the town as a vassal of Tancred, but Tancred broke the agreement. Fakhr was forced to leave Jabla and was allowed to retire peacefully to Damascus, where he spent the remainder of his life living on a pension provided by Totikan. Although Fakhr al-Mulk had lost control of Tripoli, the Egyptians were unable to hold it either, nor did William Jordan succeed in claiming it for himself. After Raymond's death, the nobles of Toulouse had recognized Bertrand as his successor. He had already governed them for nearly a decade, and they were unaware that Raymond had left behind a legitimate son. But once they learned of young Alfonso Jordan's existence, they sent word to the east, asking him to come and claim his rightful inheritance. It's understandable that Countess Elvira would choose the wealthy lands of southern France for her son, rather than a dangerous and uncertain lordship in the east. She arrived in Toulouse with Alfonso sometime in 1108. Their arrival forced Bertrand to reconsider his position. It's likely that a family agreement was reached. Bertrand renounced any claim to his father's estates in Europe, and in exchange, Alfonso Jordan gave up his rights to the holdings in the Levant, likely to ensure Bertrand's departure from Toulouse. In the summer of 1108, Bertrand set out for the east. His goal was clear: to consolidate his future principality by capturing Tripoli. He also expected resistance from William Jordan. To pursue this ambition, Bertrand brought a sizable force, 4,000 troops, both cavalry and infantry, and a fleet of 40 galleys, supplied by the ports of Provence. His young son Pons accompanied him. His first stop was Genoa, where he hoped to secure the naval support needed to take Tripoli. William Jordan had also tried to form an alliance with the Genoese, but his delegation found that Bertrand had already been accepted as the Republic's ally. Genoa had pledged to help Bertrand claim his father's conquests in the east and complete them with the capture of Tripoli. In return for favorable commercial privileges. In the autumn, Bertrand sailed eastward, accompanied by a Genoese squadron. He also planned to visit Constantinople to gain support from his father's former ally, the Byzantine emperor. Storms forced his fleet to take shelter in the Gulf of Volo at the port of Almero. There, his troops earned a good reputation by refraining from the typical Western practice of looting the countryside. As a result, when Bertrand arrived in Constantinople, Emperor Alexius was already well disposed toward him and welcomed him like a son. Bertrand received many valuable gifts and the promises of future imperial support. In return, he pledged allegiance to the emperor. From Constantinople, Bertrand and his allies sailed to St. Simeon, the port of Antioch, and sent an envoy to Tancred requesting a meeting. Tancred promptly came to meet him, but their discussion quickly turned tense. Bertrand, speaking with an air of superiority, demanded that Tancred hand over the parts of Antioch that had once belonged to his father. Tancred replied that he would consider it on the condition that Bertrand join him in a military campaign against Mamistra and the Byzantine cities of Cilicia. This proposal was impossible for Bertrand to accept. He had recently sworn allegiance to Emperor Alexius and was relying on Byzantine support. Instead, he offered to help Tancred capture the town of Jabala, where Fakhr al-Mulk had taken refuge. But Tancred insisted on joint action in Cilicia. When Bertrand flatly refused, citing his oath to the emperor, Tancred reacted with hostility. He ordered Bertrand to leave his territory and forbade anyone under his rule from selling Bertrand any supplies. Forced to move on, Bertrand sailed down the coast and entered the harbor of Tortosa. The town was controlled by one of William Jordan's lieutenants, who welcomed Bertrand, provided him with provisions, and granted him access to the city. The following day, Bertrand sent a message to William Jordan's base at Mount Pilgrim, demanding the surrender of all the lands that had belonged to his father in La Chamelle, referring to the Principality of Homs that Raymond had once hoped to establish, but William Jordan had recently achieved a notable victory. After the Egyptians assumed control of Tripoli, the town of Acre, led by one of Fakhr al-Mulk's favored servants, placed itself under the protection of Tottican of Damascus. Tottican personally set out to inspect his new possession. However, winter rains slowed his journey through the Bukhaya region. While waiting for the weather to improve, he launched attacks on several frontier fortresses held by the Christians. Seizing the opportunity, William Jordan led a surprise assault. With 300 cavalry and 200 local infantry, he crossed the Lebanon range and launched an unexpected attack near the village of Akun. Tottican's army, caught off guard, fled in panic back to Homs with William Jordan's forces in pursuit. Though the Franks didn't risk attacking Homs itself, they turned north and raided the lands around Chazar. Hearing that the Frankish force was small, the Munkidhite brothers Murshid and Sultan, emirs of Chazar, confidently rode out to confront them, expecting an easy victory. But the Franks launched a fierce and immediate attack, scattering the forces of Chazar. William Jordan then returned to Arca, which surrendered to him after a siege lasting just 3 weeks. Buoyed by his recent victories, William Jordan had no intention of giving up control to Bertrand. He insisted that he held Raymond's lands by right of inheritance and added that he had both defended and expanded them. However, the sheer size of Bertrand's fleet made him uneasy. Seeking support, he sent word to Antioch, asking Tancred to intervene on his behalf, and in exchange, he pledged to become Tancred's vassal. This move forced Bertrand to respond in kind. He dispatched a messenger to Jerusalem to present his case to King Baldwin, appealing to him as the highest authority among the Franks in the east, and thereby recognizing Baldwin as his overlord. Baldwin, a shrewd leader who believed the Franks needed unity and who envisioned himself at their helm, responded without delay. He was already displeased with Tancred over his treatment of Baldwin of Edessa and Jocelyn of Courtenay. By this time, Bertrand had moved south to Tripoli, where his forces were carrying out two operations, maintaining the blockade of the Muslim-held city and laying siege to William Jordan's loyalists stationed at Mount Pilgrim. Meanwhile, William Jordan had left Mount Pilgrim and retaken Tortosa, where he waited for Tancred's arrival. Once Tancred joined him, they were approached by royal envoys Eustace, Garnier, and Pagan of Haifa, who summoned both men to appear before the royal court outside Tripoli. The purpose was to resolve the dispute over Raymond's inheritance and also to address the matter of restoring Edessa and Tarbasil to their rightful rulers. William Jordan wanted to refuse the summons, but Tancred realized that resisting the king's authority was not a viable option. In June 1109, all the major Frankish leaders in the east gathered outside Tripoli's walls. Bertrand was already there with his troops. King Baldwin arrived from the south with 500 knights and an equal number of foot soldiers. Tancred brought 700 of his finest knights, and Baldwin of Edessa and Jocelyn came as well, each with their retinues. A formal assembly was held at the castle of Mount Pilgrim. There, Tancred was officially reconciled with Baldwin of Edessa and Jocelyn. The inheritance of the House of Toulouse was then divided. William Jordan would retain control of Tortosa and Arca, which he had conquered, while Bertrand would receive Jabail and Tripoli once the city fell. William Jordan swore fealty to Tancred, and Bertrand pledged allegiance to King Baldwin. It was further agreed that upon the death of either man, the survivor would inherit the other's lands. With peace established among the Frankish leaders, their army turned its full attention to capturing Tripoli. The city's Egyptian governor, Sharaf ad-Dawla, had been urgently requesting reinforcements from Cairo. A large fleet was prepared, complete with transport, ships for soldiers and vessels loaded with supplies. However, internal disputes and rivalries among the Egyptian commanders caused serious delays in its departure from the Delta ports. For months, the vizier made half-hearted attempts to resolve the conflicts. Eventually, the fleet was ordered to set sail, but strong northern winds kept the ships stuck in harbor. By the time a smaller contingent finally managed to leave, it was too late. Meanwhile, Tripoli was completely cut off. Genoese and Provençal fleets had blocked the port, and the Frankish army was relentlessly bombarding the city walls with every siege engine at its disposal. Realizing that resistance was futile, the defenders gave up hope. Sharaf ad-Dawla sent a message to King Baldwin, offering to surrender under certain conditions. He requested that any citizens who wished to leave be allowed to do so safely, taking their belongings with them. Those who chose to stay would become Frankish subjects, retaining their property and simply paying a special annual tax. As for himself, he asked permission to depart with his troops for Damascus. Baldwin accepted the terms, and on July 12, 1109, the Christian forces entered Tripoli. Baldwin honored the agreement. In the areas under his control, there was no looting or destruction. But the Genoese Marines, discovering that the city was undefended, forced their way in. They began looting and burning homes, killing any Muslim they encountered. It took some time before the Frankish authorities could regain control. Tragically, during the chaos, the great library of the Banu Amr, one of the finest in the Muslim world, was destroyed by fire, and its entire collection was lost. Once the city was fully secured and order restored, Bertrand was officially installed as ruler. He took the title of Count of Tripoli and reaffirmed his allegiance to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. His previous obligations to Emperor Alexius were quietly ignored. As a reward, the Genoese received a quarter of the city, a fortress 10 miles south of Tripoli called the Castle of the Constable, and 2/3 of the town of Jabail. They gave Jabail to their admiral Hugh Embriaco, whose descendants turned it into a hereditary fief. Bertrand didn't have to wait long before gaining full control over his father's eastern inheritance, while the Frankish army was still stationed. At Tripoli, William Jordan was struck by an arrow and killed. The details surrounding his death remained unclear. Apparently, he had stepped in to break up a fight between two grooms, and during the commotion, someone shot him. Suspicion naturally fell on Bertrand, but no evidence was ever found to confirm any involvement. Bertrand quickly assumed control of all William Jordan's territories, which were then brought under the authority of King Baldwin. Tancred had clearly backed the wrong side. In this way, Raymond's son ultimately fulfilled his father's dream of establishing a state in the east. It was not as grand as Raymond had once hoped. The lands of La Chamelle were never added to it, and instead of answering to the distant authority of the Byzantine emperor, the new state recognized a much nearer overlord in Jerusalem. Still, it was a wealthy and prosperous principality. Thanks to its resources and strategic location bridging the Franks of northern Syria with those of Palestine, it would come to play a key role in the history of the Crusades. **** King Baldwin's involvement in Tripoli in 1109 marked him as the foremost ruler of the Frankish East. He had earned his position through steady, determined effort and bold action. When he first arrived in Jerusalem, he faced united opposition from Patriarch Daimbert and the Prince of Antioch. What he inherited was far from a stable kingdom. The royal treasury was empty. The territory was fragmented, consisting mainly of the central mountain ridge of Palestine, the plain of Esdraelon, a few isolated fortresses surrounded by hostile lands, and his army was a small, unruly force of arrogant knights and unreliable native mercenaries. The only organized institution in the kingdom was the church, which itself was divided between followers of Daimbert and those loyal to Arnulf. Godfrey's central administration had been based on his household, which was too small and ill-equipped to manage a kingdom. The barons, who had been given control of frontier castles, ruled their lands independently. Baldwin understood that his kingdom was most vulnerable to a Muslim attack before he could establish order. Convinced that the best defense was a strong offense, he launched a campaign to intimidate the enemy before even resolving his dispute with Daimbert or formally taking the crown. His earlier victories at Edessa and the Dog River had already given him a fearsome reputation, which he intended to use to his advantage. Just a week after arriving in Jerusalem, Baldwin led a force south to Ashkelon and staged a demonstration before its walls. However, the fortress was too strong for his small army to assault, so he turned east toward Hebron, then continued into the Negev to Sagir, a village near the southern tip of the Dead Sea. Along the way, he burned villages and pressed through the wilderness of Edom to Mount Hor and the ancient monastery of St. Aaron near Petra. Though he established no permanent presence in the area, his advance had a powerful effect. The Arab tribes were intimidated, and for several years they avoided intruding into his lands. Baldwin returned to Jerusalem just before Christmas. By then, Patriarch Daimbert had reconsidered his position and accepted the new reality. On Christmas Day in the year 1100, he crowned Baldwin as King of Jerusalem. In return, Baldwin confirmed Daimbert in his role as Patriarch. In early spring of 1101, Baldwin received word that a wealthy Arab tribe was passing through the region of Transjordan. He quickly led a detachment across the river and launched a surprise night attack on their camp. Few of the Arabs managed to escape. Most of the men were killed in their tents, while the women and children were taken captive along with a large amount of gold, fine textiles, and other valuables. Among the prisoners was the pregnant wife of one of the tribe's sheiks. When Baldwin learned of her condition, he ordered her release along with her maid, 2 female camels, and ample supplies of food and water. She gave birth safely along the road, where her husband soon found her. Deeply touched by Baldwin's generosity, he followed after him to express his gratitude and pledged to repay the kindness one day. News of Baldwin's raid further enhanced his reputation. In March, delegations from the coastal cities of Arsuf, Caesarea, Acre, and Tyre arrived in Jerusalem bearing valuable gifts. Around the same time, Dukhak of Damascus offered 50,000 gold bezants to ransom the prisoners Baldwin had taken at the Battle of the Dog River. an offer that helped solve Baldwin's urgent financial needs, but the tribute from Arsuf and Caesarea did them little good in the long run. That March, a Genoese fleet appeared off the coast of Haifa, and on April 15th, it docked at Jaffa. Among the passengers was Maurice, Cardinal Bishop of Porto, sent as papal legate by Pope Paschal. Up until then, Baldwin had relied on a small Pisan fleet linked to his rival, Archbishop Daimbert, for naval support. An alliance with the Genoese, the Pisan's chief competitors, was far more favorable to him. Baldwin hurried to Haifa to welcome the fleet and receive the papal legate. He invited the Genoese leaders to Jerusalem to celebrate Easter, where they made an agreement to support him for a season. In return, they would receive 1/3 of all spoils, both goods and money, from any conquests, as well as a street in the market district of every captured city. Once the deal was finalized, the Allies launched a campaign against Arsuf, with Baldwin attacking by land and the Genoese by sea. The city's resistance quickly crumbled. Its leaders offered to surrender on the condition that the inhabitants could leave peacefully with their families and possessions for Muslim-held territory. Baldwin agreed, and his troops escorted them safely to Ashkelon. He then stationed a garrison in Arsuf and granted the Genoese their promised share of the city. From Arsuf, the Allies moved on to Caesarea, launching their siege on May 2nd. Trusting in their city's ancient Byzantine fortifications, the garrison refused to surrender. But on May 17th, Caesarea was taken by force. Baldwin gave his soldiers permission to loot the city freely, and the brutality of the sack even horrified the Crusader leaders themselves. The most savage massacre occurred in the Great Mosque, a building that had once been Herod Agrippa's synagogue. Many civilians had sought refuge there, pleading for mercy, but they were slaughtered, men and women alike, until the floor ran with blood. Almost no one was spared. Only a handful of girls and infants survived. Baldwin personally intervened to save the city's chief magistrate and the garrison commander, hoping to ransom them for a high price. This violence was not random, it was intentional. Baldwin wanted to send a clear message. Anyone who negotiated surrender would be treated fairly, but those who resisted would face absolute ruthlessness. Baldwin barely had time to divide the spoils with his Genoese allies and install a Frankish garrison before urgent news reached him. An Egyptian army had entered Palestine. The Fatimid vizier, al-Afdal, was determined to avenge his earlier defeat at Ashkelon 2 years prior. He sent an expedition under the Mamluk commander Sa'd ad-Dawla al-Kavasi. The army arrived in Ashkelon by mid-May and advanced as far as Ramleh, likely aiming to strike Jerusalem while Baldwin was still engaged in the siege at Caesarea. Baldwin quickly mobilized his forces and rushed to Ramleh. In response, Sa'd withdrew to Ashkelon to await reinforcements. Baldwin fortified Ramleh and then established his headquarters in Jaffa, where he could monitor Egyptian movements and maintain access to his naval support. Aside from a brief administrative trip to Jerusalem in July, he remained stationed in Jaffa throughout the summer. At the end of August, Baldwin intercepted a letter confirming that Egyptian reinforcements had arrived and that their army was preparing to march on Jerusalem. On September 4th, Sa'd began moving his troops toward the outskirts of Ramleh. 2 days later, Baldwin convened a war council and chose to launch a preemptive strike at dawn rather than wait for the Egyptians to make the first move. Though he had only 260 cavalry and 900 infantry, Baldwin's men were well-equipped and battle-hardened. In contrast, the Egyptian force, estimated at 11,000 horsemen and 21,000 foot soldiers, was poorly armed and lacked training. Baldwin divided his army into 5 divisions. One was led by the knight Bervold, another by Galdemar Carpanel, Lord of Haifa. A third was under Hugh of St. Omer, who had succeeded Tancred as Prince of Galilee. The final 2 divisions were commanded by Baldwin himself, inspired by the presence of the true cross, a rousing sermon from Arnulf of Rose, and the special absolution granted by the cardinal legate. The Franks marched out to confront the Egyptian army. At sunrise, they attacked near Ebelin, southwest of Ramleh. Bervold led the initial charge, but his forces were cut down by the Egyptians, and he was killed in the fighting. Geldemar Carpinel rushed to assist him but met the same fate, along with all his men. The Galilean division followed, but their attack made little impact against the massive Egyptian army. After suffering heavy losses, Hugh of St. Omer managed to withdraw his troops and retreat toward Jaffa, pursued by the Egyptian left wing. At that moment, it appeared that the battle was lost, but King Baldwin, after publicly confessing his sins before the true cross and delivering a passionate speech to rally his men, mounted his trusted Arab horse Gazelle and led his knights straight into the center of the enemy. The Egyptians, overconfident and unprepared, were caught off guard. After a short but fierce engagement, their central ranks broke and fled, and the panic quickly spread to their right flank. Baldwin, forbidding his men from looting corpses or plundering the enemy camp, pursued them all the way to the gates of Ashkelon. Only then did he regroup his forces and return to divide the spoils from the battlefield. Meanwhile, Hugh of St. Omer had reached Jaffa and reported that the battle was lost. The queen and her court were there, and believing the king to be dead, they sent a messenger to the only person they believed could help Tancred in Antioch. But the next morning an army appeared on the horizon. At first, those in Jaffa feared it was the Egyptians. Their relief and joy were immense when they saw the Frankish banners and realized Baldwin was alive and victorious. Another messenger was immediately sent to Antioch to inform Tancred that the crisis had passed and his assistance was no longer needed for the time being. The danger had been pushed back. The Egyptians had suffered severe losses and were in no position to launch another attack that season. Still, Egypt's vast resources made a renewed offensive inevitable. The Fatimid vizier, al-Afdal, had little trouble raising a second army to continue the war the following year. In the meantime, Baldwin welcomed the surviving leaders of the 1101 Crusade in Anatolia. These included William of Aquitaine, Stephen of Blois, Stephen of Burgundy, Constable Conrad, and various barons from the Low Countries, along with Eckhard of Ora and Bishop Manasses. Most had traveled by sea to Antioch and reached the area near Beirut in early spring of 1102 to ensure their safe journey through hostile territory. Baldwin sent an escort to bring them to Jerusalem. After celebrating Easter at the holy sites, the leaders prepared to return home. William of Aquitaine departed safely from St. Simeon at the end of April. However, the ship carrying Stephen of Blois, Stephen of Burgundy, and several others was caught in a storm and driven ashore near Jaffa before another vessel could be arranged. News arrived that a new Muslim army was advancing from Egypt. Because of this unfortunate delay, they remained in the Holy Land to take part in the next battle. In mid-May 1102, an Egyptian army of around 20,000 Arabs and Sudanese, led by the vizier's son, Sharaf al-Mali, gathered at Ashkelon and began advancing toward Ramleh. Baldwin had made preparations. A Christian army several thousand strong was stationed in Jaffa, and the Galilean garrisons were ready to send reinforcements if needed. However, Baldwin was misinformed by his scouts. Believing that the Egyptian force was just a small raiding party, he decided to attack with only his own forces, without calling in his reserves. At that time, he was in Jerusalem with several Western allies: Stephen of Blois, Stephen of Burgundy, Constable Conrad, Hugh, Count of Lusignan, and other knights from Belgium. Baldwin proposed to ride out with his cavalry to quickly deal with the supposed threat. Stephen of Blois hesitated and suggested that more reconnaissance was needed, but no one paid attention. His past retreat at Antioch had tarnished his reputation, so he joined the expedition without further protest. On the 17th of May, Baldwin set out from Jerusalem with about 500 horsemen. They rode confidently with little discipline, but once they reached the plains and suddenly saw the full size of the Egyptian army, Baldwin realized the grave error. There was no turning back. Egyptian light cavalry had already spotted them and was moving to cut off any retreat. The only option left was to charge directly into the enemy. At first, the Egyptians were confused, thinking this bold attack must be the front line of a larger army. They nearly broke. But when no reinforcements appeared behind the Frankish cavalry, they recovered and closed in. The Franks were overwhelmed. Some knights, led by Roger of Rozoy and Baldwin's cousin, Hugh of Labourg, managed to break through and escape to Jaffa. Others, including Gerard of Avon and Stabillon, Godfrey's former chamberlain, were killed. On the battlefield, King Baldwin and a handful of his closest companions found refuge in the small fortress at Ramleh, where they were quickly surrounded by the Egyptian army. Nightfall prevented an immediate assault. But Ramleh's defenses were weak. Only a single tower built by Baldwin the previous year offered any real protection, and everyone crowded inside. In the middle of the night, an Arab man arrived at the gate and asked to speak with the king. He was admitted and revealed that he was the husband of the woman whom Baldwin had spared during the raid on Transjordan. Grateful for the past kindness, he warned Baldwin that the Egyptians would launch their attack at dawn and urged him to escape while he still could. Baldwin followed the advice, though he may have regretted abandoning his comrades, and he was not known for an exaggerated sense of honor. He understood that the fate of the kingdom depended on his survival. With a groom and 3 companions, he mounted his horse, Gazelle, and slipped out through the enemy lines under the cover of darkness. That same night, Lithard of Cambrai, Viscount of Jaffa, and Gothman of Brussels also escaped. Though badly wounded, Gothman managed to reach Jerusalem and brought news of the disaster. He urged the city to hold out, believing Baldwin was still alive. At dawn, the Egyptians stormed the city walls and set firewood around the base of the tower where the knights were holed up. Rather than die in the flames, the Frankish knights, led by Constable Conrad, charged out in a final act of defiance. But there was no escape. They were either killed on the spot or captured. Conrad fought with such bravery that the Egyptians spared his life. He and over 100 of his men were taken prisoner and sent to Egypt. Among the fallen were Stephen of Burgundy, Hugh of Lusignan, and Geoffrey of Vendôme. Stephen of Blois also perished in the battle, redeeming the shame of his earlier retreat with a heroic death. His wife, Countess Adela, could finally be at peace. Meanwhile, the queen and the royal court had taken refuge in Jaffa. There, Roger of Rozoy and the other survivors reported the crushing defeat. Believing Baldwin had died with his knights, they prepared to flee by sea while they still had the chance. On May 20th, the Egyptian army arrived at the city walls, and their fleet appeared on the southern horizon. Their worst fears seemed confirmed when an Egyptian soldier waved a severed head that resembled the king's. It was actually the head of Gerbot of Winthink, who bore a strong likeness to Baldwin. At that very moment, as if by miracle, a small ship appeared on the sea from the north, flying the king's own banner at its mast. After escaping from Ramleh, Baldwin made his way toward the coast, hoping to reach his forces at Jaffa, but Egyptian patrols were searching the countryside. For 2 days and nights, he wandered through the hills north of Ramleh, then crossed the plain of Sharon to reach Arsif. He arrived there on the evening of the 19th. To the surprise and joy of its governor, Roger of Haifa, that same night 80 elite knights from Galilee, led by Hugh of St. Omer, arrived at Arsif. They had rushed south upon hearing of the Egyptian advance. The next morning, Hugh marched toward Jaffa, hoping to break through the siege lines. Baldwin, meanwhile, persuaded an English adventurer named Godric to sail him through the Egyptian naval blockade. To boost morale among his people, Baldwin raised his standard. The Egyptians noticed and sent ships to intercept him, but a strong north wind held them back while carrying Baldwin swiftly into the harbor. Once inside Jaffa, Baldwin wasted no time reorganizing his forces. Before the Egyptians could fully surround the city, he broke out and brought Hugh's troops safely within the walls. He then sent a message to Jerusalem, calling for reinforcements from there and from Hebron. A local monk volunteered to deliver the message, and though it took him 3 days to get through enemy lines, he reached Jerusalem and confirmed that the king was alive. The news brought great celebration. A force of around 90 knights and a larger group of mounted sergeants was quickly assembled. Blessed with a relic of the true cross, they rode for Jaffa. The knights, better equipped and mounted, broke through the Egyptian lines and entered the city, while the sergeants were driven to the shore. They abandoned their horses and swam around the city's defenses to reach the harbor. Meanwhile, Baldwin sent word to Tancred and Baldwin of Edessa, explaining his losses and requesting reinforcements. But before they could respond, unexpected help arrived. In the final days of May, a fleet of 200 ships, mostly English, filled with soldiers and pilgrims from England, France, and Germany, arrived off the coast. Thanks to favorable winds, they sailed through the Egyptian blockade and reached Jaffa, now reinforced. Baldwin led his troops out to face the Egyptians on May 27th. The exact details of the battle are unclear, but it appears the Egyptians attempted to draw Baldwin into a trap and surround him. However, a powerful charge by the heavily armored Frankish cavalry shattered their lines and sent them into a full retreat toward Ashkelon. Within hours, the entire Egyptian army was in flight, and their camp, along with its treasures, fell into Christian hands. Baldwin and his kingdom were saved by a series of fortunate events that many Christians naturally saw as divine intervention. One of the most critical of these was the poor strategy of the Egyptians. After the Battle of Ramleh, a small force could have easily taken Jerusalem without compromising their siege of Jaffa, but the Egyptian vizier, al-Afdal, was beginning to lose control. His son Sharaf lacked strength and authority, and internal rivalries among their commanders paralyzed their efforts. The following summer, a new campaign was launched by both land and sea. While the fleet sailed toward Jaffa, the land army refused to advance beyond Ashkelon. Its commander, the Mameluke Taj al-Ajam, was jealous of the admiral, the Qadi ibn Qadis. Taj al-Ajam was later imprisoned for his disobedience, but by then the damage had been done. The Egyptians had missed their best chance to reclaim Palestine. Meanwhile, Tancred and Baldwin of Labourg, upon learning of Jerusalem's danger, made plans to march south. William of Aquitaine, who was in Antioch when King Baldwin's message arrived, joined them. Their force traveled down the Orontes Valley, past Homs, and along the upper Jordan. They were so numerous that the local Muslim authorities made no attempt to block their path. They reached Judea in late September. By then, Baldwin no longer urgently needed reinforcements, but their arrival gave him the strength to attack the Egyptian army at Ashkelon. Although the Christians had the upper hand in skirmishes, they did not attempt to storm the fortress. This gathering of Frankish leaders proved useful to Baldwin for another reason. Tancred had planned to give his support under his own conditions, but instead, his presence helped Baldwin resolve a major internal issue. Patriarch Daimbert had reluctantly crowned Baldwin king on Christmas Day in 1100, and Baldwin had long suspected his disloyalty. Baldwin needed to control the church, which was the best organized institution in the kingdom in the primary. Recipient of donations and legacies from the West, Daimbert's appointment as patriarch had been questionable, and complaints had reached Rome. Eventually, Pope Paschal sent a legate, Maurice, the Cardinal Bishop of Porta, to investigate. Maurice arrived in time for Easter 1101, and Baldwin immediately accused Daimbert of betrayal, presenting a letter Daimbert had written to Bohemond after Godfrey's death, urging him to block Baldwin's succession by force if necessary. Baldwin also claimed Daimbert had tried to assassinate him on his way south. That charge was likely false, but the letter was undeniable. Maurice barred Daimbert from performing the Easter ceremonies, taking over the role himself. Fearing for his future, Daimbert tearfully begged Baldwin for forgiveness. Baldwin remained firm until Daimbert quietly offered him 300 bezants. Baldwin, always in need of money, accepted the bribe in secret and then publicly declared his willingness to forgive. Maurice, eager to restore peace, welcomed the reconciliation. A few months later, Baldwin once again found himself in need of funds and turned to Daimbert for help. The patriarch handed over 200 marks, claiming it was all that remained in the church treasury. However, clerics aligned with Arnulf informed the king that Daimbert was hiding substantial wealth. Shortly afterward, Daimbert hosted a lavish banquet to honor the papal legate, whose favor he was eager to secure. Baldwin suddenly appeared at the gathering and rebuked them all for indulging in luxury while the Christian army was going hungry. Daimbert angrily retorted that the church could use its wealth however it chose and that the king had no authority over it, while Maurice the legate tried desperately to calm both sides, but Baldwin refused to back down. His early education? As a priest allowed him to cite canon law convincingly, and he spoke so persuasively that Maurice was swayed. He persuaded Daimbert to agree to fund a cavalry unit. However, despite Baldwin's constant demands, the money was never delivered. Later that year, in the autumn of 1101, an envoy from Prince Roger of Apulia arrived with a gift of 1,000 gold bezants for the patriarch. The donation was to be divided equally, 1/3 for the Holy Sepulchre, 1/3 for the hospital, and 1/3 for the king's army. Daimbert, unwisely, kept the entire amount for himself, but the terms of the gift were widely known. When Baldwin protested, even the legate could no longer support Daimbert. He was officially removed from the Patriarchate. Daimbert withdrew to Jaffa for the winter and then continued on to Antioch in March. There, his old ally Tancred welcomed him warmly and appointed him to oversee one of the city's wealthiest churches, St. George. Meanwhile, Baldwin left the Patriarchate vacant, claiming Rome needed to be informed first. His officials searched the patriarchal treasury and uncovered 20,000 bezants that Daimbert had secretly hidden. Maurice served temporarily as acting patriarch, but the strain of these scandals affected his health, and he died in the spring of 1102. When Tancred came south later that year to aid Baldwin, he made Daimbert's restoration one of his conditions. Daimbert returned with him. Baldwin, ever pragmatic, played along. But just then a new papal legate, Robert, Cardinal of Paris, arrived. Baldwin insisted that the matter be addressed formally by a synod, with Robert presiding. Tancred and Daimbert had no choice but to comply. A council temporarily reinstated Daimbert until a proper inquiry could take place. Tancred then joined Baldwin's forces for the campaign against Ashkelon. Soon after, the synod was held at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The legate Robert presided, assisted by the visiting bishops of Lyon and Piacenza. All the bishops and abbots of Palestine attended, along with the Bishop of Mamistra from Tancred's territory. The charges against Daimbert were brought forward by the prelates of Caesarea, Bethlehem, and Ramleh. Likely under the influence of Arnulf of Rose, they accused Daimbert of attacking fellow Christians on the Ionian Islands during his 1099 journey to Palestine with the Pisan fleet, of attempting to stir civil war between Baldwin and Bohemond, and of keeping funds meant for pilgrims and crusading soldiers. The accusations were undeniably true. The legate had no choice but to declare Daimbert unfit for office and officially depose him. Tancred had to accept the verdict, as the procedure was completely canonical. Defeated, he took Daimbert back to Antioch, where the disgraced patriarch resumed his post at St. George's Church while he waited for a chance to plead his case in Rome. Daimbert, a corrupt and greedy old man, left Palestine with few regrets from anyone. His appointment as papal legate had been Pope Urban II's one major misjudgment. Arnulf of Rose, who had been a loyal supporter of Baldwin throughout the affair, was too clever to try claiming Daimbert's position for himself. Instead, when the papal legate requested a nominee for the patriarchate, the bishops of Palestine proposed an elderly priest from Therouanne named Evrimar. Evrimar had come to the east with the First Crusade and was known for his devotion and generosity. Although he was from the same region as Arnulf, he had remained uninvolved in any political scheming and was widely respected. The legate was pleased to consecrate such an uncontroversial cleric, and Baldwin approved, confident that Evrimar was a harmless old man who would avoid political entanglements. This allowed Arnulf to continue his own maneuvering undisturbed. But Daimbert had not given up. When his patron Bohemond traveled to Italy in 1105, Daimbert went with him and appealed his case directly to the Pope. Pope Paschal, though initially cautious, eventually decided, likely influenced by Bohemond's persuasion, to back Daimbert. Baldwin was summoned to Rome to answer the charges against him. However, aware that Bohemond held the Pope's favor, Baldwin simply ignored the demand. As a result, Paschal annulled Daimbert's deposition, claiming it was the result of improper interference by secular authorities. Fortunately for Baldwin, this papal mistake was soon corrected by fate. Just as Daimbert was preparing to return to Palestine and reclaim his post in triumph, he fell seriously ill and died in Messina on June 15, 1107. Still, the issue of the Patriarchate was not resolved. Baldwin began to lose confidence in Evremar, likely realizing that the church was too powerful an institution to be led by someone ineffective. He needed a competent and cooperative leader. After learning that Daimbert had been officially reinstated, Evremar traveled to Rome to present his own grievances. He arrived only to find Daimbert already dead, and used the opportunity to voice complaints about secular interference. But when word of Daimbert's death reached Palestine, Arnulf quickly journeyed to Rome to represent Baldwin's interests. Pope Paschal now leaned toward supporting Evremar, but he also recognized that the matter was more complex than he had initially thought. He assigned it to the Archbishop of Arles, Gibelin of Sabran, a man of great age and experience. Gibelin arrived in Palestine in the spring of 1108, where both Evremar and Arnulf had already gone ahead of him. After assessing the situation, he concluded that Evremar was unsuited for the patriarchate and that no one really supported his return. He declared the position vacant and convened a synod to appoint a new patriarch. To his surprise and slight embarrassment, Baldwin nominated him for the role. Gibelin accepted the position, and Evremar was given the archbishopric of Caesarea as compensation, which had conveniently just become vacant. Rumor had it that Arnulf convinced the king to appoint Gibelin as patriarch because of his advanced age, expecting the seat would soon be vacant again. In fact, Gibelin only lived another 4 years, and upon his death, Arnulf was finally elected patriarch without opposition. From Baldwin's perspective, Arnulf was the perfect choice. Despite later conflicts over the king's remarriage and the deep dislike many clerics felt for him, Arnulf managed to hold on to his position. He was certainly corrupt when his niece Emma married Eustace Garnier. He granted her a valuable estate in Jericho that belonged to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but he was also active, competent, and completely loyal to the king, thanks to Arnulf. The unrealistic vision of the First Crusade's leaders, that Jerusalem would be ruled as a theocracy with the monarch acting merely as a military protector, was decisively abandoned. He ensured that the church in Palestine aligned with his outlook, even removing the canons of the Holy Sepulchre appointed by Godfrey of Lorraine because he doubted their allegiance. As the kingdom expanded, Arnulf strongly advocated for civil and ecclesiastical boundaries to match, opposing Pope Paschal, who, with his unfortunate favoritism toward the Norman rulers of Antioch, continued to defend the outdated claims of the Antiochian Church. Arnulf was far from a virtuous man, but he was an effective servant of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Though the historian William of Tyre condemned him harshly, his reputation tarnished unfairly. Arnulf played a significant role in securing the legacy of the First Crusade. Both Arnulf and King Baldwin also deserve credit for establishing good relations between the Latin Church and the native Christian communities. During his first time as patriarch in 1099, Arnulf had expelled the Eastern Christian sects from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and seized their possessions. Yet Daimbert proved an even more hostile figure. His policy was to exile all native Christians not just from the main church, but also from their monasteries and other institutions in Jerusalem, whether they were Orthodox like the Greeks and Georgians or seen as heretical such as the Armenians, Jacobites, and Nestorians. He even scandalized local sensibilities by allowing women to serve in the sacred spaces, according to tradition. Because of these offenses, all the lamps in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre went out on Easter Eve in 1101, and the sacred fire refused to descend until the 5 expelled communities prayed together for the Franks to be forgiven. Baldwin took the message seriously and ensured that justice was done. The keys to the sepulchre were returned to the Greeks, and from then on, he seemed to enjoy the backing of all Christian groups in Palestine. While the higher clergy in the Latin Church were all Franks, there were Greek canons in the Holy Sepulchre. The Orthodox population accepted this arrangement, especially since many of their senior clergy had fled the region during the turmoil leading up to the Crusades. Though the Latin clergy were never popular, local Orthodox monasteries continued operating freely, and Orthodox pilgrims visiting during the Frankish rule found no cause for complaint from either the Church or the secular authorities. Even the so-called heretical churches seemed to be content. This situation stood in stark contrast to northern Syria, where both Orthodox and heterodox Christians deeply resented their Frankish rulers as oppressors. The Egyptian defeat at Jaffa in 1102, along with the failed campaign of spring 1103, did not mark the end of al-Afdal's attempts to reclaim territory. However, it took him some time to gather another army. Baldwin used the lull to strengthen his control over the Palestinian coast. Although he held the towns from Jaffa up to Haifa, Muslim raiders still prowled the roads between them, especially near Mount Carmel. Even the route from Jaffa to Jerusalem remained dangerous, as noted by the pilgrim Saywolf from the Egyptian-controlled ports of Tyre and Acre. Pirates would frequently set out to attack Christian merchant ships. In the late autumn of 1102, storms forced several ships carrying home the pilgrims who had helped save Baldwin at Jaffa ashore along the coast, some near Ashkelon, others between Tyre and Sidon. The passengers were either slaughtered or sold. In Egyptian slave markets. In the spring of 1103, Baldwin, still aided by a few English ships, launched a siege against Acre. The city was on the verge of surrender when 12 Fatimid galleys and a large transport ship from Tyre and Sidon arrived. They were heavily manned and equipped with machines capable of launching Greek fire. Baldwin was forced to abandon the siege. Later that summer, he attempted to drive the bandits out of Mount Carmel. The campaign met with limited success. During one skirmish, Baldwin suffered a severe wound to his kidneys, and for a time, his survival was uncertain. While he lay recovering in Jerusalem, news came of a joint expedition led by Taj al-Ajam and Ibn Qadis, but Taj's refusal to advance beyond Ashkelon left Ibn Qadis to besiege Jaffa alone. His assault was weak, and once Baldwin had recovered enough to lead a force to the coast, the Egyptian fleet withdrew. The following May, a Genoese fleet of 70 galleys, which had recently aided Raymond of Toulouse in capturing Jebel, arrived. In Haifa, Baldwin met with its leaders and secured their support for another attempt on Acre. As usual, the terms were 1/3 of the spoils, commercial privileges, and a quarter of the bazaar in any captured city. The siege began on May 6th. The Fatimid commander, the Mameluke Benazar ad-Dawla al-Uyushi, resisted fiercely but received no reinforcements from Egypt. After 20 days, he offered to surrender under terms similar to those agreed at Arsif. Any citizen who wished to leave could do so with their portable possessions, while those who remained would become subjects of the Frankish king. Baldwin accepted and honored the agreement, even reserving a mosque for his Muslim subjects. However, the Italian sailors could not tolerate seeing so much wealth slip through their fingers. They attacked the departing citizens, killing many and robbing the rest. Baldwin was enraged and considered turning his army against the Genoese in retaliation. Only the timely arrival of Patriarch Evermar prevented open conflict. As he intervened and managed to restore peace between the parties, the capture of Acre provided Baldwin with something he desperately needed: a harbor that could be used year-round. Although it lay more than 100 miles from the capital, Acre quickly became the kingdom's main port, replacing Jaffa, which lacked shelter from the open sea. In addition, Acre was the primary port through which goods from Damascus were exported to the west, and its conquest by the Franks did not disrupt this trade. In fact, the Muslim residents who remained in the city continued to support and encourage the commercial activity. In the summer of 1105, the Vizier al-Afdal made one last attempt to reclaim Palestine. He assembled a well-equipped army of 5,000 Arab cavalry and Sudanese infantry under the command of his son, Sena al-Mulk Hussein. Learning from their past failures, the Egyptians decided to seek support from the Turkish rulers of Damascus. Such an alliance would have been extremely valuable in 1102 or 1103. However, by 1105, Dukak of Damascus had died in June 1104, and his family was locked in a succession struggle with his Atabeg Tatakan. Meanwhile, Redwin of Aleppo arrived to try and claim influence for himself. Tatakan initially placed Dukak's 1-year-old son, Tutash, on the throne, but soon replaced him with Dukak's 12-year-old brother, Urtash. Urtash, suspicious of Tatakan's motives, fled to the Hauran, where the local emir, Etekin of Bosra, offered him refuge. From there, Urtash appealed to King Baldwin, who invited him to Jerusalem under these unstable conditions. Tottekin was willing to support the Egyptians but could not afford to commit many troops. He sent his general Sabawa south with 1,300 mounted archers. In August, the Egyptian army advanced into Palestine, where they were joined by the Damascene forces that had traveled through Transjordan and across the Negev. Baldwin was already positioned at Jaffa when the Egyptian fleet appeared off the coast. He moved to the familiar battleground at Ramleh. Jaffa was left under the command of Lithard of Cambrai, who had 300 men. Baldwin was joined by the young Damascene claimant Urtash and all the Frankish troops in Palestine, including the garrisons from Galilee, Haifa, and Hebron along, with the central army totaling 500 cavalry and 2,000 infantry. At Baldwin's request, Patriarch Evermar also came down from Jerusalem, bringing with him 150 men and the true cross.